Book 1, Chapter 1, Part 3. I walked out to the garden beside the restaurant and stood behind a cedar bench facing the fountain. To my right, I could see the pulsating lights at the airport and hear the roaring engines of a jet ready for takeoff. "What beautiful flowers," Charlene said from behind me. I turned to see her walking towards me along the walkway, admiring the rows of petunias and begonias which bordered the sitting area. She stood beside me, and I put my arm around her. Memories flooded my mind. Years ago, when we had both lived in Charlottesville, Virginia, we had spent regular evenings together talking. Most of our discussions were about academic theories and psychological growth. We had both been fascinated by the conversations and by each other, yet it struck me how platonic our relationship had always been. "I can't tell you how nice it is to see you again." "I know," I replied. "Seeing you brings back a lot of memories." "I wonder why we didn't stay in touch." Her question took me back again. I recalled the last time I had seen Charlene. She was telling me goodbye at my car. At the time I felt full of new ideas and was departing for my hometown to work with severely abused children. I thought I knew how such children could transcend the intense reactions, the obsessive acting out, that kept them from going on with their lives. But as time had progressed, my approach had failed. I had to admit my ignorance. How humans might liberate themselves from their past was still an enigma to me. Looking back over the previous 6 years, I now feel sure the experience had been worthwhile. Yet I also felt the urge to move on. But to where? To do what? I had thought of Charlene only a few times since she helped me crystallize my ideas about childhood trauma, and now here she was again, back in my life, and our conversation felt just as exciting as before. "I guess I got totally absorbed in my work." "So did I," she replied. "At the paper it was just one story after another. I didn't have time to look up, and I forgot about everything else." I squeezed her shoulder. "You know, Charlene, I had forgotten how well we talked together. Our conversation seemed so easy and spontaneous." Her eyes and smile confirmed my perception. "I know. Conversations with you give me so much energy." I was about to make another comment when Charlene stared past me towards the entrance of the restaurant. Her face grew anxious and pale. What's wrong?" I asked, turning to look in that direction. Several people were walking towards the parking lot, talking casually, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I turned to face Charlene. She still appeared alarmed and confused. "What was it?" I repeated. "Over by that row of cars. Did you see the man in the gray shirt?" I looked towards the parking lot again. Another group was exiting through the door. "What man?" "I guess he's not there now," she said, straining to see. She looked directly into my eyes. "When the people at the other tables described the man who stole my briefcase, they said he had thinning hair and a beard and wore a gray shirt. I think I just saw him over there by the cars watching us." A knot of anxiety formed in my stomach. I told Charlene I would be right back, and I walked to the parking lot to go take a look around, careful not to get too far away. I saw no one who fit the description. When I returned to the bench, Charlene took a step closer to me and said softly, "Do you suppose this person thinks I have a copy of the manuscript, and that's why he took my briefcase? He's trying to get it back?" "I don't know, but we're going to call the police again and tell them what you saw. I think they ought to check out the passengers on your flight." We walked inside and called the police, and when they arrived we informed them of what had occurred. They spent 20 minutes checking each car, then explained they could invest no more time. They did agree to check all the passengers boarding the plane Charlene would be on. After the police had left, Charlene and I found ourselves standing alone again by the fountain. "What were we talking about anyway, before I saw that man?" "We were talking about us, Charlene." "Why did you think to contact me about all this?" She gave me a perplexed look. "When I was in Peru and the priest was telling me about the manuscript, you kept popping into my mind." "Oh yeah?" I didn't think too much about it then, but later, after I returned to Virginia, every time I would think of the manuscript, I would think of you. I started to call several times, but I always got distracted. Then I received this assignment in Miami that I'm heading to now, and discovered after I boarded a plane that I had a layover here. When I landed, I looked up your number. Your answering machine said to contact you at the lake only in an emergency, but I decided it would be okay to call. I looked at her for a moment, unsure of what to think. Of course. I'm glad you did. Charlene glanced down at her watch. It's getting late. I'd better get back to the airport. I'll drive you. We drove to the main terminal and walked towards the embarkation area. I watched carefully for anything unusual. When we arrived, the plane was already boarding and one of the policemen we had met was observing each passenger. When we approached him, he told us he had observed everyone scheduled to board and no one fit the description of the thief. We thanked him, and after he had left, Charlene turned and smiled at me. I guess I better go, she said, reaching out to hug my neck. Here are my numbers. Let's keep in touch this time. Listen, I want you to be careful. If you see anything strange, call the police. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. For an instant we looked deeply into each other's eyes. What are you going to do about this manuscript? I asked. I don't know. Listen for news reports about it, I guess. What if it's suppressed? She gave me another of her full smiles. I knew it. You're hooked. I told you you'd love it. What are you going to do? I shrugged. See if I can find more about it, probably. Good. If you do, let me know. We said a goodbye again, and she walked away. I watched as she turned once and waved, then disappeared down the boarding corridor. I walked to my truck and drove back to the lake, stopping only for gas. When I arrived, I walked out to the screen porch and sat in one of the rockers. The evening was loud with crickets and tree frogs, and in the distance I could hear a whippoorwill. Across the lake, the moon had sunk lower in the west and sent a rippled line of reflection towards me on the water's surface. The evening had been interesting, but I was still skeptical about the whole idea of a cultural transformation. Like many people, I had been caught up in the social idealism of the 60s and 70s, and even in the spiritual interests of the 80s, but it was hard to judge what was really happening. What kind of new information could possibly alter the entire human world? It all sounded too idealistic and far-fetched. After all, humans had been living on this planet for a long time. Why would we suddenly gain insight into our existence now, at this late date? I gazed out at the water for a few more minutes, then turned off the lights and went into the bedroom to read.